What happens when a master's greatest lesson becomes his most painful truth? When confidence turns to shock in the span of a single heartbeat? This is the story of Master Chen Wei, a martial arts legend who believed he had seen the limits of human potential, until one devastating moment shattered everything he thought he knew about strength, weakness, and the fragile line between teacher and student. In a world where respect is earned through discipline and power is measured by control, one sentence would echo through the halls of an ancient dojo forever: humans are weak. But sometimes, the very students we underestimate become the mirrors that reflect our own vulnerabilities back at us, and sometimes those reflections cut deeper than any blade ever could. The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding the Jade Phoenix Martial Arts Academy like ancient secrets refusing to be unveiled. Master Chen Wei stood in the center of the main training hall, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched his students practice their forms. At 62 years old, Chen had dedicated his entire life to the martial arts, transforming from a scrappy street fighter in Shanghai to one of the most respected masters in all of China. The academy itself was a testament to his success. Built into the mountainside with traditional architecture that seemed to grow from the rock itself, the compound housed over 300 students from around the world. The main hall where Chen now stood could accommodate 100 practitioners at once, its polished wooden floors bearing the scuffs and marks of decades of training. Red pillars stretched toward a ceiling painted with dragons and phoenixes, symbols of the power and grace Chen sought to instill in his students. But, on this particular morning, Chen's expression was darker than usual. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his dark eyes held a coldness that made even his most senior students nervous. The reason for his mood stood before him in the form of 30 new recruits, fresh-faced young people from various countries who had come to learn the ancient arts. They moved through their basic forms with the awkwardness of beginners, stumbling over techniques that Chen could perform in his sleep. Pathetic, Chen muttered under his breath, loud enough for the nearby students to hear. Look at them. Soft. Weak. No discipline, no understanding of what true strength requires. His assistant instructor, Lu Meng, a former student who had trained under Chen for 15 years, approached cautiously. Lu was a compact man with prematurely gray hair, earned through years of pushing his body to its limits under Chen's tutelage. He had seen his master in many moods, but there was something different about today's displeasure. "Master," Lu said quietly, bowing slightly. "Perhaps we should start with the fundamentals. They have only been here for 3 days." Chen turned to face his assistant, and Lu instinctively took a half-step backward. The master's presence was overwhelming when he was angry, like standing too close to a fire that might suddenly flare and consume everything nearby. 3 days, 3 months, 3 years, Chen said, his voice carrying across the hall and causing several students to pause in their practice. It matters not. These modern humans, they lack the spirit of our ancestors. They come here thinking they can become warriors through comfort and encouragement. They have never known real hardship, real pain, real dedication. Chen began walking slowly around the group of new students, who had stopped their practice entirely and now stood in nervous silence. His footsteps echoed in the hall, each one deliberate and measured. Several students glanced at each other uncertainly, sensing the tension building like pressure before a storm. "In my youth," Chen continued, his voice rising slightly, "students would train until their hands bled, until their bodies could barely stand, until their minds broke through the barriers of perceived limitation. We understood that weakness was not a starting point to be coddled, but an enemy to be destroyed." One of the new students, a young woman from Germany named Anna, raised her hand tentatively. She was tall and athletic, with the build of someone who had played sports in university, but her movements in martial arts were still uncoordinated and hesitant. "Master Chen," she said in accented English, "should we continue with the form, or would you like us to silence?" Chen's voice cracked like a whip, and Anna flinched as if she had been physically struck. "You speak when you are given permission to speak. You move when you are told to move. You think when you are instructed to think. This is not your gymnasium back home where everyone receives a participation trophy." The hall had fallen completely silent now. Even the advanced students who were training on the far side of the room had stopped to listen. Chen's reputation for strictness was legendary, but many of the newer students had hoped the stories were exaggerated. They were beginning to understand that they were not. Chen stopped in front of a young man from Brazil named Carlos, who stood about 6 feet tall with a muscular build that suggested years of weight training. Carlos had come to the academy with high hopes and significant confidence in his physical abilities. He met Chen's gaze steadily, perhaps the only student in the group who did not seem intimidated by the master's presence. "You," Chen said, pointing directly at Carlos. "You believe you are strong, yes? I can see it in your eyes. You have lifted weights, perhaps practiced some fighting in your country. You think your muscles make you powerful." Carlos straightened his shoulders slightly and nodded. "I have trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 6 years, master. I came here to learn traditional martial arts and expand my knowledge." A thin smile played at the corners of Chen's mouth, but it held no warmth. 6 years, he repeated. How impressive. And, in those 6 years, did anyone teach you that true strength comes not from muscle, but from spirit? Did anyone show you that the greatest power lies not in what you can do to others, but in what you can do to yourself? I understand that mental discipline is important, Carlos replied carefully, but physical conditioning is also mental discipline, Chen interrupted with a harsh laugh. You understand nothing. You are like all the others, like all humans who come here believing they already possess some portion of what we teach. You are weak, and your weakness is not merely in your technique or your understanding. It is in your very nature as a modern human being. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Carlos's jaw tightened slightly, and several other students shifted uncomfortably. Anna looked as though she might cry, while others stared at the floor, unwilling to meet Chen's piercing gaze. Chen began walking again, his hands still clasped behind his back, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture. You come from societies that have forgotten the meaning of true hardship. You have never known real hunger, real cold, real desperation. Your governments protect you, your parents coddle you, your schools teach you that effort deserves reward regardless of result. You are the products of comfort, and comfort breeds weakness. He stopped and faced the group once more. In ancient times, warriors were forged in fire. They learned to fight not in safe training halls with padded floors and rules, but in life or death situations where weakness meant death. They understood that the body is merely a vessel, and that true power comes from the will to push beyond what seems possible. Lu Ming watched from the sidelines, recognizing the signs of one of his master's philosophical moods. Chen was brilliant, there was no question of that, but his views on modern humanity had grown increasingly harsh over the years. Lu sometimes wondered if his master's criticism of others was really a reflection of his own fears about growing older and losing his edge. Master, Lu said gently, perhaps we could demonstrate some techniques for the students? They learn better through observation and practice than they learn better through understanding their place, Chen cut him off sharply. And their place is at the bottom, in the dirt, among the weak and unworthy, until they prove otherwise. He turned back to the students, his expression stern. I will tell you something that your previous teachers probably never told you. You are weak. Not just inexperienced, not just untrained, but fundamentally weak in the way that all modern humans are weak. You lack the warrior spirit that separates the strong from the soft. Anna finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly when she spoke. But, Master, if we are here to learn, shouldn't we start somewhere? Everyone begins as a beginner. Chen's eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her take a step backward. Beginning implies potential for improvement. What I see before me is not potential, but limitation. You come here carrying the softness of your generation like a weight that drags you down. You expect comfort, encouragement, gentle correction. You want to feel good about your efforts rather than actually achieving results. He began pacing again, his voice growing more passionate. True martial arts are not about making you feel better about yourself. They are about destroying the weak person you were and rebuilding something stronger from the ruins. But most of you lack the strength to even begin that destruction. You are too attached to your comfort, too afraid of real pain, too weak to embrace the suffering that creates strength. The master stopped directly in front of Carlos again, studying the young man's face for any sign of surrender or submission. Carlos met his gaze evenly, though the muscles in his neck and shoulders were visibly tense. You still believe you are different, Chun observed. You still think your 6 years of rolling around on mats with your friends has prepared you for what I teach here. You are wrong. Your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a sport, a game with rules and referees. What I teach is a way of life, a path of transformation that weak humans cannot walk. With respect, Master, Carlos said, his voice steady despite the obvious provocation, I came here to learn from you, not to be insulted. If you believe I'm weak, then teach me to be strong. Isn't that why you have this academy? The question seemed to surprise Chen, and, for a moment his expression flickered with something that might have been approval. Then, the hardness returned, deeper than before. Teach you to be strong? Chen repeated slowly. Strength cannot be taught to those who lack the capacity to receive it. You cannot pour water into a broken vessel and expect it to hold. Most humans are broken vessels, cracked by softness and comfort, unable to contain the power that true martial arts require. Lu Ming stepped forward again, sensing that his master might be crossing a line that would be difficult to retreat from. Master Chen, perhaps we could. No, Chen said firmly, raising a hand to stop his assistant. These students need to understand the truth about themselves before they can begin to change. They need to understand that their humanity, as they currently express it, is an obstacle to overcome, not a foundation to build upon. He looked around the group once more, his gaze lingering on each face. You want to know what separates the strong from the weak? The strong accept hard truths and use them as motivation. The weak make excuses and seek comfort. The strong embrace pain as a teacher. The weak avoid it and remain ignorant. The strong understand that their current selves are inadequate and must be destroyed. The weak cling to who they are and resist change. Chen clasped his hands behind his back once more and stood in silence for several long moments, allowing his words to sink in. The students remained frozen, unsure whether they should resume training, speak, or simply leave. The tension in the hall was thick enough to cut with a knife. I have trained thousands of students over my lifetime, Chen finally continued. Some have achieved greatness, becoming masters in their own right. But most have fallen away, defeated not by the techniques or the physical demands, but by their own weakness. They could not accept the truth about themselves. They could not embrace the destruction necessary for rebirth. His voice dropped lower, becoming almost conversational, which somehow made his words even more unsettling. Human beings, in their current form, are weak creatures. They are driven by comfort, distracted by pleasure, motivated by fear rather than purpose. They seek shortcuts, easy answers, gentle paths to power. But power does not come gently. Strength is not achieved through kindness. Warriors are not forged in comfortable circumstances. Anna was definitely crying now, though she tried to hide it by looking down at the floor. Several other students looked equally shaken, while Carlos stood rigid with barely controlled anger. The master's words were having exactly the effect he intended, though whether that effect was beneficial remained to be seen. Chen began walking toward the exit of the hall, then paused and turned back to face the group one final time. Tomorrow, we will begin to test whether any of you possess the capacity to transcend your humanity and achieve something greater. Those who prove themselves worthy will continue their training. Those who reveal themselves to be irredeemably weak will be shown the door. He took a few more steps toward the exit, then stopped again without turning around. I suggest you spend the rest of today contemplating whether you have the courage to face the truth about yourselves, and whether you possess the strength to do something about it. Most humans do not. Most humans are weak, and weakness is a choice. With that, Master Chen Wei walked out of the hall, leaving behind a group of stunned and shaken students who were beginning to understand that their journey at the Jade Phoenix Academy would be far more challenging than they had ever imagined. The dormitory that housed the new students buzzed with nervous energy as the evening shadows lengthened across the mountain compound. The simple wooden building contained 20 small rooms, each housing 2 students, and tonight those rooms felt more like prison cells than places of rest. The events of the morning training session had left deep marks on everyone present, and the conversations taking place behind closed doors ranged from angry defiance to tearful consideration of leaving. In room 12, Anna sat on her narrow bed with her knees drawn up to her chest, staring out the small window at the mist-shrouded peaks. Her roommate, a quiet girl from Japan named Yuki, sat at the small desk attempting to practice calligraphy, but her usually steady hand was shaking too much to form the characters properly. "I don't understand," Anna said quietly, breaking the silence that had lasted for over an hour. "In Germany, I trained with some very strict instructors. Military people, Olympic coaches. But this felt different. It felt cruel." Yuki set down her brush and turned to face her roommate. Her English was precise but careful, each word chosen deliberately. "In Japan, we have a saying, the nail that stands out gets hammered down. Master Chen is trying to hammer down our confidence, our sense of self. But I think maybe he is also trying to find which of us is made of metal that cannot be hammered." Down the hall, in room 8, Carlos paced back and forth in the small space like a caged tiger. His roommate, Ahmed from Morocco, sat cross-legged on the floor in meditation posture, but his eyes were open and watchful. 6 years, Carlos muttered, running his hands through his hair. 6 years of training, competing, pushing myself to the limit. I've faced fighters who could break bones with their bare hands, and I've never backed down. But that old man, the way he looked at me, the way he talked about humans being weak, it got under my skin." Ahmed opened his eyes fully and studied his roommate's agitated movements. "Perhaps that was his intention," he said calmly. "In my country, the desert teaches many lessons. One of them is that the wind that seems gentlest can sometimes move the largest dunes, while the strongest storms sometimes leave no lasting mark. Master Chen's words were a storm, but what kind of marks they leave depends on what we are made of underneath." Carlos stopped pacing and turned to face Ahmed. "You think he's right? You think we're weak?" "I think," Ahmed replied carefully, "that strength and weakness are not always what they appear to be. A tree that bends in the wind may survive while a tree that stands rigid breaks. But a tree that has deep roots may stand firm while shallow roots give way. The question is not whether we are strong or weak, but what kind of strength we possess and what kind we need to develop." In the main courtyard, under the pale light of the moon, Lu Ming walked slowly along the stone pathways, making his rounds to ensure all students were in their dormitories for the night. But his mind was not on his duties. Instead, he was thinking about his master and the increasingly harsh turn his teachings had taken over the past few years. Lu remembered his own early days as a student, nearly 2 decades ago. Chen had been strict then, demanding and uncompromising, but there had been an underlying compassion to his methods. He had pushed students to their limits, but he had also been quick to acknowledge progress and provide encouragement when it was needed. Somewhere along the way, that balance had shifted. The pushing had become harsher, and the encouragement had all but disappeared. As Lu passed beneath the window of the master's private quarters, he could see Chen silhouetted against the warm glow of lamplight. The older man sat in meditation posture, completely still, but something about his positioning suggested tension rather than peace. Lu had served as his assistant for 15 years, and he had learned to read the subtle signs of his master's emotional state. Tonight, Chen was not at peace. Lu continued his patrol, but his thoughts remained troubled. He had noticed that Chen's criticism of modern humanity and weak humans had intensified after several personal disappointments. 3 years ago, his most promising student had left the academy to pursue commercial martial arts, appearing in movies and competitions rather than continuing the traditional path. 2 years ago, Chen's own son had refused to take over the academy, choosing instead to become a businessman in Hong Kong. And, last year, Chen's longtime friend and fellow master had died suddenly, leaving Chen feeling isolated and perhaps questioning his own legacy. In room 15, 2 students from different continents found themselves having remarkably similar conversations with their roommates. David from England and Marcus from South Africa had both come to the academy with years of traditional martial arts experience, and both were struggling to understand Chen's approach. "It's like he wants us to hate ourselves," David said to his roommate, a serious young man from Russia named Alexei. "Every martial arts instructor I've ever had focused on building confidence and self-respect. This feels like psychological warfare." Alexei nodded slowly. "In Russia, we understand that sometimes the harshest training produces the strongest results. But there must be purpose behind the harshness, not just cruelty for its own sake. I am beginning to wonder if Master Chen has lost sight of that purpose. Meanwhile, Marcus was having a similar conversation with his roommate Pierre from France. My grandfather fought in wars, Marcus said. He used to tell me that the strongest enemies were not always the ones with the biggest muscles or the loudest voices. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones who convinced you that you were already defeated before the fight began. Pierre raised an eyebrow. You think Master Chen is trying to defeat us psychologically before teaching us anything? I think, Marcus replied carefully, that he's testing something deeper than our physical abilities. The question is whether we're strong enough to pass whatever test he has in mind, or whether we'll break under the pressure. As midnight approached, the dormitory gradually fell silent, but sleep did not come easily to most of the students. In room after room, young people lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying Chen's words and trying to decide whether they had the courage and determination to face whatever tomorrow would bring. In the advanced students' quarters, a different kind of conversation was taking place. These were the students who had been at the academy for months or years, who had survived Chen's initial testing and proven themselves worthy of continued instruction. But even they were concerned about what they had witnessed in the main hall. I've never seen Master Chen quite like that, said Elena, a Russian student who had been at the academy for 2 years. She was speaking quietly with Zhang Wei, a Chinese student who was one of Chen's most senior pupils. Master Chen has always been demanding, Zhang Wei replied, but you're right. There was something different today. More personal, more angry. Usually his strictness serves a purpose in the training. Today it felt like punishment. Elena nodded. Some of those new students looked genuinely frightened. I remember being nervous when I first arrived, but not terrified. There's a difference between challenging someone and trying to break them. In his private quarters, Chen sat motionless in meditation, but his mind was far from peaceful. The events of the day played through his thoughts like a broken record, and he found himself questioning his own actions even as he tried to justify them. He had not lied to the students about the weakness he saw in modern humanity. The young people who came to his academy were indeed softer than previous generations, more accustomed to comfort and less familiar with real hardship. But, if he was being honest with himself, his harsh words had been motivated by more than just pedagogical concerns. Chen thought about his son, who had dismissed the martial arts as ancient nonsense and chose to pursue wealth instead of wisdom. He thought about his former student who had commercialized the sacred techniques, turning them into entertainment for the masses. He thought about the changing world outside his mountain refuge, where ancient traditions were being abandoned in favor of modern conveniences. But, most of all, he thought about his own advancing age and the growing awareness that his time as a master was limited. In his youth, he had believed that strength could overcome any obstacle, that discipline could solve any problem, that the warrior's path would lead to lasting fulfillment. Now, approaching his 7th decade, he was beginning to wonder if he had dedicated his life to something that the world no longer valued or needed. These doubts had been growing for years, like shadows lengthening as the sun set on his career. And, perhaps, he admitted to himself in the quiet darkness of his room, his harsh treatment of the new students was not really about their weakness at all. Perhaps it was about his own fear that everything he had spent his life building was crumbling around him. Chen rose from his meditation cushion and walked to the window, looking out at the dormitory where his newest students were presumably sleeping. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, new opportunities to push them toward either greatness or failure. But, tonight, for the first time in many years, he was not entirely certain which outcome he was hoping for. In the dormitory, Carlos finally fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of combat and competition. Anna cried herself to sleep, questioning whether she belonged at the academy at all. Ahmed maintained his meditative breathing throughout the night, using techniques learned in the Moroccan mountains to center himself for whatever trials lay ahead. And, in the room closest to the master's quarters, a young woman named Sarah from Canada lay awake with a different expression on her face than any of her fellow students. While the others wrestled with doubt, fear, or anger, Sarah's eyes held a calm intensity that suggested she had heard something in Chen's words that the others had missed. Sarah had come to the academy with her own secrets, her own history of hardship that none of the other students knew about. While they had grown up in relative comfort and security, she had spent her teenage years caring for a terminally ill mother, working multiple jobs to pay for medical treatments, and learning that life could be brutally unfair without warning or apology. Chen's words about human weakness had not frightened or offended her. Instead, they had resonated with something deep inside her that she had never been able to articulate. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that hall, that strength was not a birthright but a choice made daily in the face of overwhelming difficulty. As the moon set behind the mountains and dawn began to approach, Sarah smiled quietly to herself. Tomorrow, while the other students would likely spend their time either cowering before Master Chen's harsh words or rebelling against them, she planned to do something different entirely. She planned to listen to what he was really trying to teach them, beneath all the anger and disappointment and fear. Because she suspected that Master Chenwei was not the cruel taskmaster he appeared to be, but rather a broken man trying to pass on something precious to a generation he believed incapable of receiving it. And, if that was true, then, perhaps the greatest challenge facing the students of the Jade Phoenix Academy was not learning to endure Chen's harsh words, but learning to see past them to the deeper wisdom they contained. The question was whether any of them possessed the insight and courage to make that journey, or whether they would remain trapped on the surface level of hurt feelings and wounded pride. The answer would begin to reveal itself with the rising of the sun. Dawn broke over the mountains with an unusual clarity, as if the very air had been washed clean by the previous day's tensions. Master Chen stood in the main training hall earlier than usual, arriving before even the most dedicated senior students had begun their morning routines. The empty space felt different in the pre-dawn silence, more like a temple than a training ground, and Chen found himself remembering why he had fallen in love with the martial arts in the first place. He had been here since 4 a.m, moving through his own forms with the fluid precision that came from 5 decades of daily practice. His body might be aging, his hair might be gray, and his joints might protest more than they once did, but when he moved through the ancient sequences, he felt connected to something timeless and pure. It was in these quiet moments that he could sometimes glimpse the man he had been before disappointment and frustration had hardened his heart. The sound of soft footsteps on the wooden floor interrupted his meditation. Chen turned, expecting to see Lu Ming or perhaps one of his senior students, but instead found himself looking at Sarah, the young woman from Canada. She stood at the edge of the training area, dressed in simple practice clothes, her posture respectful but not subservient. "Master Chen," she said quietly, bowing slightly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to begin training early." Chen studied her carefully. Unlike the other new students, Sarah showed no signs of the emotional turmoil that his words had created the day before. Her eyes were clear and focused, her stance balanced and ready. There was something about her presence that reminded him of his most serious students, the ones who understood that martial arts were not just about learning to fight, but about learning to live. "You are 2 hours early," Chen observed. "The morning session does not begin until 7. "I know," Sarah replied. "But I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, and I realized that I have a lot to learn. I thought perhaps I could start with basic conditioning and meditation, if that would be acceptable." Chen felt a flicker of surprise. In all his years of teaching, he had rarely encountered a student who responded to harsh criticism by asking for more training rather than less. Most either became defensive and argumentative, or fell into self-doubt and discouragement. This young woman seemed to have found a third path entirely. "What exactly have you been thinking about?" Chen asked, his tone carefully neutral. Sarah took a small step forward, maintaining eye contact but keeping her voice respectful. "You said that modern humans are weak, and I think you're right about many of us. We're used to comfort and convenience. We expect immediate results and easy solutions. But I also think that some of us have faced real challenges, real hardship, and maybe learned something from it." Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. This was not the response he had expected. "And you believe you are one of those who has learned from hardship?" "I don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly. "That's what I'm here to find out. But I do know that everything truly valuable I've ever learned has come from situations that were difficult, uncomfortable, or painful. So when you tell us that the path here will be hard, that doesn't frighten me. It makes me more interested in walking it." For a long moment, Chen said nothing. He walked slowly around Sarah, observing her posture, her breathing, the way she held herself under his scrutiny. She remained still and centered, neither defensive nor eager to please, simply present and attentive. "Tell me about this hardship you claim to have experienced," Chen said finally. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Chen could see her choosing her words carefully. When she spoke, her voice was steady but carried undertones of old pain. "My mother was diagnosed with cancer when I was 14, she began. Aggressive, fast-moving, expensive to treat. My father left when the medical bills started piling up. I spent 3 years working every job I could find while trying to keep up with school, watching someone I loved waste away despite everything I did to save her." She paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "She died when I was 17. I could have been angry at the unfairness of it, or bitter about all the sacrifices that didn't matter in the end. Instead, I learned that strength isn't about avoiding pain or defeat. It's about what you choose to do when pain and defeat are inevitable." Chen felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of cynicism he had been carrying for years. This young woman was not the soft, privileged child he had assumed her to be. There was steel beneath her quiet demeanor, forged in fires that would have broken many people twice her age. "And what did you choose to do?" he asked. "I chose to keep going," Sarah said simply. "I finished school, saved money, traveled, learned languages, studied different philosophies and martial arts. I came here not because I want to feel good about myself, but because I want to understand what real strength looks like. I want to know how much further I can push myself, how much I can grow." Chen walked to the center of the training area and gestured for Sarah to join him. "Show me your basic stance," he said. Sarah moved into position, her feet properly spaced, her weight evenly distributed, her hands held in a basic guard position. Chen circled her again, this time making small corrections to her posture, adjusting the angle of her shoulders, the placement of her feet. "Better," he said. "Now show me the first form you learned yesterday." Sarah began moving through the sequence they had been taught, and Chen immediately saw what he had missed the day before. While most of the new students had been focusing on memorizing the movements, Sarah was already beginning to understand the principles behind them. Her transitions were smoother, her balance more stable, her breathing synchronized with her motion. "Stop," Chen said after she had completed the form. "Again, but this time, slow down. Feel each position, understand the purpose of each movement." Sarah nodded and began again, this time moving with deliberate care. Chen watched with growing interest as she demonstrated an intuitive grasp of concepts that usually took weeks for students to develop. She was not just copying the movements, she was beginning to embody them. As they worked together in the quiet hall, the sun climbed higher over the mountains, and gradually other students began to arrive for the regular morning session. Chen was aware of them gathering at the edges of the training area, but he continued working with Sarah, guiding her through increasingly complex variations of the basic forms. Carlos was among the first to arrive, and he stood watching with a mixture of confusion and resentment. Yesterday, Master Chen had dismissed all of them as weak and worthless, but now he was providing personal instruction to one of their group. What made her special? What did she have that the rest of them lacked? Anna arrived next, followed by Ahmed, David, and the others. They formed a loose circle around the edge of the training area, unsure whether they should begin their own practice or wait for instructions. The sight of Sarah receiving Chen's undivided attention was both inspiring and intimidating. "Your breathing is still too shallow," Chen told Sarah as she moved through a complex sequence of strikes and blocks. "Power comes from the center, from deep within the body. Breathe into your lower abdomen, let the air fill your entire torso." Sarah adjusted her breathing pattern, and immediately her movements became more fluid and powerful. Chen nodded approvingly and stepped back to observe her complete the form. "Better," he said. "But still too much tension in your shoulders. You are holding on to something you need to release." "I'm trying to get the movements perfect," Sarah replied, pausing to look at him directly. "Perfect technique is not achieved by forcing the body into rigid positions," Chen explained. "It comes from understanding the natural flow of energy and learning to guide it rather than constrain it. You cannot control the river by building walls, you must learn to channel it." As Chen continued coaching Sarah, Lu Ming entered the hall and immediately sensed that something significant was happening. He had worked with his master long enough to recognize the subtle signs of Chen's genuine engagement with a student. The anger and frustration that had dominated Chen's demeanor the day before had been replaced by something Lu had not seen in years: authentic teaching enthusiasm. Lu approached the group of watching students and gestured for them to begin their own morning warm-up routines. They spread out across the hall and began moving through basic exercises, but their attention remained focused on the interaction between Chen and Sarah. The ancient masters taught that there are 3 types of students, Chen was saying to Sarah as she practiced a series of defensive techniques. Those who learn what you teach them, those who learn what you show them, and those who learn what you don't even know you're teaching. The 3rd type is the rarest and the most valuable. Sarah paused in her practice to consider his words. Which type am I? That remains to be seen, Chen replied. But you are asking better questions than most students ask in their first year of training. As the morning session progressed, Chen gradually began including the other students in the instruction, but the dynamic of the class had fundamentally changed. Where the previous day had been dominated by criticism and negativity, this session was focused on genuine teaching and learning. Chen still corrected mistakes firmly and demanded high standards, but his approach had more patience and less anger. Carlos found this transformation particularly difficult to understand. He had spent much of the night preparing himself for another confrontational encounter with the master, psyching himself up to prove his worth through determination and defiance. Instead, he found himself in a normal training environment where his previous martial arts experience was acknowledged and built upon rather than dismissed. Your jiu-jitsu background gives you good body awareness, Chen told him as they worked on grappling applications. But you must learn to adapt those skills to different contexts. Brazilian jiu-jitsu teaches you to fight on the ground, traditional martial arts teach you to avoid going to the ground in the first place. It was a fair and accurate assessment, delivered without the harsh condescension of the previous day. Carlos found himself responding positively to the instruction, his natural competitiveness channeled into productive learning rather than defensive anger. Anna, too, began to relax as the session continued. Chen's corrections of her technique were specific and helpful, focusing on what she needed to improve rather than what she was doing wrong. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she was actually learning something rather than just being tested and found wanting. But it was Sarah who continued to draw Chen's primary attention throughout the morning. There was something about her approach to learning that resonated with everything he valued most in the martial arts. She listened carefully to instruction, practiced diligently, asked thoughtful questions, and demonstrated a level of self-discipline that impressed even the senior students. During a brief water break, Lu Ming approached his master with curiosity evident on his face. "Master," he said quietly, "yesterday you seemed convinced that this group of students was hopeless. What has changed your mind?" Chen glanced across the hall to where Sarah was helping Anna with a difficult technique, demonstrating the movement with patience and precision. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I was looking at them through the lens of my own disappointment rather than seeing what was actually there. One student has reminded me that strength can take many forms, and that wisdom sometimes comes disguised as humility." Lu followed his master's gaze and nodded with understanding. "She is different from the others." "Yes," Chen agreed. "But, more importantly, she has reminded me of something I had forgotten about teaching. The goal is not to break students down to prove they are weak. The goal is to help them discover strengths they did not know they possessed." As the morning session drew to a close, Chen gathered all the students together in the center of the hall. They arranged themselves in neat rows, kneeling in the traditional position of respect, waiting for his final words. Chen stood before them for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than stern. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the harsh criticism that had characterized his speech the day before. "Yesterday, I spoke harshly to you about weakness and strength," he began. "My words were true, but perhaps incomplete. Yes, many modern humans are weak, soft, unprepared for real challenges. But I have been reminded today that some of you carry hidden strengths, forged in fires I cannot see." He paused, his gaze moving slowly across the group. "The martial arts are not about proving you are already strong. They are about discovering what kind of strength you can develop when properly guided and challenged. Some of you will surprise yourselves. Some of you will surprise me. And, perhaps, if I am fortunate, some of you will teach me things I thought I already knew. Sarah knelt in the front row, her expression calm and attentive. She had achieved something remarkable in just one morning. She had reminded a cynical master why he had devoted his life to teaching. But, as Chen dismissed the class and the students began filing out of the hall, neither she nor anyone else could have predicted how dramatically her presence would soon change everything at the Jade Phoenix Academy. 3 weeks had passed since that transformative morning session, and the atmosphere at the Jade Phoenix Academy had undergone a remarkable evolution. What began as a group of intimidated and demoralized students had gradually transformed into a cohesive training community under Sarah's quiet influence and Chen's renewed passion for teaching. The master had not abandoned his demanding standards or his belief in pushing students to their limits, but his approach had become more constructive and less destructive. Sarah had emerged as an unofficial leader among the new students, not through any attempt at dominance, but simply by demonstrating the attitude and work ethic that Chen valued most. She was always the first to arrive at training and the last to leave. When other students struggled with techniques, she offered help without being asked. When Chen delivered particularly challenging lessons, she absorbed them without complaint and pushed herself to implement them immediately. But, perhaps most remarkably, Sarah had begun to bridge the gap between the new students and the advanced ones. Students like Zhang Wei and Elena, who had initially been skeptical of the newcomers, found themselves drawn into conversations with Sarah about philosophy, technique, and the deeper meanings behind their training. She had a gift for asking questions that made everyone think more deeply about what they were doing and why. On this particular morning, Chen had announced that they would be conducting special testing sessions to evaluate the progress of all students, from beginners to advanced practitioners. The tests would not be typical examinations of memorized forms or predetermined techniques, but rather explorations of how well each student could apply their training under pressure and uncertainty. The main hall had been arranged differently for the occasion. Mats covered the floor, and various training implements were placed around the room. Senior students served as assistants and observers, while Chen positioned himself in the center of the space, radiating the focused intensity that always preceded his most important lessons. Today, Chen announced as the students assembled, we will discover what you have truly learned, not just what you think you have learned. Knowledge that exists only in the mind is worthless. Understanding that cannot be expressed under pressure is not understanding at all. We will test your ability to remain centered when challenged, to apply technique when threatened, to maintain principle when everything seems to be falling apart. Carlos, who had made significant progress over the past 3 weeks, stepped forward first. His previous resistance to Chen's methods had been replaced by genuine respect and eagerness to prove himself. The master nodded approvingly at his willingness to volunteer. You will face Zhang Wei, Chen announced. But this will not be a sparring match. Zhang will attack you with full intention, using any technique he chooses, and you must respond appropriately. You will not know what is coming, when it is coming, or how intense it will be. You must rely entirely on your training and your ability to remain present in the moment. Carlos took his position in the center of the mat, his breathing steady but his muscles visibly tense. Zhang Wei, a compact man with several years of advanced training, moved to the opposite side of the circle. His expression was serious but not hostile. This was a teaching exercise, not a personal confrontation. Begin, Chen said simply. Zhang Wei immediately launched into a series of rapid attacks, mixing punches, kicks, and grappling attempts in an unpredictable sequence. Carlos responded well initially, his Brazilian jiu-jitsu background helping him deal with the grappling elements, but, as the intensity increased, his technique began to deteriorate. He started relying too heavily on strength and becoming too rigid in his responses. Stop, Chen called after about 2 minutes of intense action. Carlos, what happened? Carlos was breathing heavily, sweat running down his face. I started okay, but then I got overwhelmed. I couldn't keep up with the pace, and I reverted to my old habits. Precisely, Chen said. Under pressure, you abandoned your training and tried to force solutions through aggression. This is a common failure. True martial arts must work when you are tired, confused, and afraid, not just when you are fresh and confident. Chen turned to address the entire group. This is why we train forms, why we practice meditation, why we work on breathing and centering. Not because these things are mystical, but because they create automatic responses that function even when your conscious mind is overwhelmed. Anna stepped forward next, volunteering to face Elena in a similar test. The challenge proved even more revealing, as Anna's tendency to overthink became more pronounced under pressure. She hesitated before every response, trying to choose the perfect technique rather than allowing her training to flow naturally. "Stop," Chen said again. "Anna, you are fighting two opponents, Elena and yourself. You cannot defeat both simultaneously." "I was trying to do everything correctly," Anna replied, frustration evident in her voice. "Correct technique is important," Chen acknowledged, "but correct timing is more important, and correct spirit is most important of all. If you hesitate to choose the perfect response, your opponent will not wait for your decision to be complete." Several more students took their turns, each revealing different aspects of how training translates into practical application under stress. Some discovered that their physical conditioning was not as complete as they had believed. Others found that techniques they could perform perfectly in isolated practice became clumsy and ineffective when combined with real pressure. Ahmed demonstrated remarkable composure and flowed between techniques with admirable smoothness, earning praise from Chen for his ability to remain centered. David showed good technical knowledge but became too predictable in his responses. Marcus displayed impressive power but lacked the subtlety needed for more sophisticated applications. Throughout these tests, Sarah watched with intense focus, not just observing the techniques being demonstrated, but studying the mental and emotional dynamics at play. She could see how stress affected different students in different ways, how some became more aggressive while others became more hesitant, how personal temperament and previous experience shaped responses under pressure. Finally, Chen turned to her. "Sarah," he said, "you will face a different kind of test." He gestured for her to step into the center of the circle, but, instead of calling for one of the senior students to challenge her, he positioned himself opposite her. A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled students. Chen rarely participated directly in testing exercises, preferring to observe and guide from the sidelines. "Master," Lu Ming said quietly, "are you certain this is appropriate?" Chen raised a hand to stop his assistant's concern. "Sarah has been teaching all of you through her example for 3 weeks. Now I want to see what she has learned when that teaching is tested." Sarah took her position with characteristic calmness, but her eyes showed the heightened alertness of someone who understood the significance of the moment. To be tested personally by Master Chen was an honor that even some senior students had never received, but it was also a challenge that carried enormous pressure. "The test is simple," Chen explained to the group while keeping his gaze fixed on Sarah. "I will attack with techniques drawn from 50 years of training. Sarah must respond not just with what she has learned here, but with everything she has learned in life. This is not about perfect technique. This is about perfect adaptation." The hall fell completely silent. Even the senior students, who had seen thousands of training exercises over the years, recognized that they were about to witness something unusual. Chen's decision to personally test a 3-week novice was unprecedented in their experience. "Begin," Chen said. What happened next would be discussed and analyzed by students and instructors for years to come. Chen moved with the fluid precision of a master, launching an attack that combined elements from multiple martial arts traditions. His strike came from an unexpected angle, with perfect timing and devastating potential force. Most students, even advanced ones, would have been overwhelmed by the speed and sophistication of the assault. But Sarah did something that surprised everyone, including Chen himself. Instead of trying to block the attack or counter it with a specific technique, she seemed to dissolve away from it, moving with a fluidity that made Chen's strike pass harmlessly through empty space. Then, in the same continuous motion, she flowed back toward him with a response that was both completely natural and utterly unpredictable. Chen found himself off balance, not because Sarah had overpowered him, but because she had responded in a way that his experience had not prepared him for. Her movement was not based on any formal technique he recognized, yet it was perfectly appropriate to the situation. It was as if she had internalized the principles behind all techniques and was expressing them in a completely personal and spontaneous way. Chen regained his balance and pressed the attack, increasing the intensity and complexity of his assault. But, with each exchange, Sarah seemed to become more rather than less centered. Instead of being overwhelmed by the pressure, she appeared to be drawing energy and clarity from it. The watching students stared in disbelief as their newest classmate engaged their master in what appeared to be an equal exchange. Sarah was not overpowering Chen, she was not outthinking him or outmaneuvering him. Instead, she was meeting his attacks with responses that seemed to emerge from some deeper place than conscious technique. Chen began to realize that he was not just testing Sarah, she was teaching him something about the nature of true martial arts application. Her responses were not coming from a library of memorized techniques, but from a profound understanding of natural movement and timing that most students took years to develop. After several minutes of intense exchange, Chen stepped back and raised his hand to signal the end of the test. The hall remained silent as he studied Sarah's face, looking for signs of strain or exhaustion. Instead, he found her breathing steady, her expression calm, her posture balanced and ready. "How?" he asked simply. Sarah took a moment to consider the question, her eyes thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered something important about herself. "I stopped trying to do martial arts," she said, and started trying to be present with what was actually happening. Every technique you showed me over the past 3 weeks, every principle you taught, every correction you made, I tried to understand not just what to do, but why it worked. When you attacked me, I didn't think about which technique to use. I just responded from that understanding." Chen nodded slowly, and, for the first time in years, his expression showed genuine amazement. "You have just demonstrated something that most martial artists never achieve, even after decades of training. You have shown the difference between knowing martial arts and being martial arts." He turned to address the assembled students, his voice carrying a weight of significance that made everyone lean forward to listen carefully. "What you have just witnessed," Chen said, "is the goal toward which all our training points. Sarah did not defeat me through superior technique or greater strength. She responded from a place of complete integration between mind, body, and spirit. This is what the ancient masters meant when they spoke of becoming one with the art." Chen paused, his gaze moving slowly across the group of students who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "I have spent 50 years studying martial arts," he continued, "and I have just been reminded by a 3-week student that knowledge and understanding are not the same thing. Sarah understands something about these arts that I am still learning to understand." The implications of his words settled over the group like ripples spreading across still water. Chen, the master who had called them weak and worthless just weeks before, was publicly acknowledging that he had learned something from one of his newest students. But, as Sarah stood in the center of the circle, accepting the congratulations and amazed stares of her fellow students, neither she nor anyone else in the hall could have anticipated how dramatically this demonstration would change everything about her relationship with Master Chen and her future at the academy. The test had revealed more than just her martial arts ability. It had shown the presence of something that Chen had been searching for his entire teaching career without quite knowing what he was looking for. The student had become the teacher, and the teacher was about to learn the most difficult lesson of his life. The days following Sarah's extraordinary demonstration had been filled with an unusual energy at the Jade Phoenix Academy. Students who had witnessed the exchange between her and Master Chen spoke about it in hushed, reverent tones, as if they had seen something sacred. Chen himself had become more introspective, spending long hours in meditation and private practice, clearly processing the implications of what had occurred. But it was Lu Ming who first noticed the subtle changes in his master's behavior that suggested something deeper than mere reflection was taking place. Chen had begun asking questions about Sarah's background, her training history, her approach to learning. He had started watching her with an intensity that went beyond normal instructor interest, studying her movements with the focus of someone trying to decode a mystery. On the morning that would change everything, Chen announced that he wanted to conduct another advanced demonstration, this time exploring the applications of internal energy in combat. The concept of qi, or life force, was central to traditional Chinese martial arts, but it was also one of the most difficult aspects for Western students to understand and accept. Internal energy is not mysticism, Chen explained to the assembled students as they gathered in the main hall. It is the natural result of proper alignment, correct breathing, and mental focus. When these elements combine correctly, the body can produce effects that seem impossible but are actually the expression of natural principles. He had arranged for several demonstrations, starting with simple exercises showing how proper breathing could enhance strength and balance, then progressing to more complex applications involving the direction of force through minimal physical contact. The senior students participated as partners, allowing Chen to show how subtle adjustments in posture and timing could neutralize much larger and stronger opponents. Sarah watched these demonstrations with the same intense focus she brought to all her training, but Chen could see something else in her expression: recognition. She was not struggling to understand these concepts as most students did. She was seeing the connections between what he was showing and principles she had already internalized. "Sarah," Chen called out, "please join me for the next demonstration." She stepped forward with her characteristic calm confidence, taking her position opposite the master. The other students formed a circle around them, anticipating another remarkable exchange like the one they had witnessed during the testing session. "I want to show the application of redirected force," Chen announced. "Sarah will attack with full power, and I will demonstrate how proper technique can turn her strength against herself." This was a standard demonstration that Chen had performed hundreds of times with various partners. The principle was simple: when an opponent committed fully to an attack, a skilled martial artist could use precise timing and positioning to redirect that energy, often sending the attacker to the ground with minimal effort on the defender's part. Sarah nodded her understanding and took an attack position. Chen settled into his defensive stance, his body relaxed but ready, his mind focused on the timing and positioning that would make the demonstration successful. "Attack with full commitment," Chen instructed. "Do not hold back or try to make this easier for me. The technique only works against real force." Sarah launched herself forward with explosive power, her strike aimed directly at Chen's center with the kind of committed intensity that made redirection techniques possible. Chen began his response, stepping aside at precisely the right moment, his hands moving to guide her momentum in a new direction. But something went wrong. Instead of flowing with his redirection as students typically did, either consciously or unconsciously, Sarah seemed to sense his intention and adapt to it instantaneously. Her attack, which should have been committed and therefore vulnerable to redirection, somehow became fluid and responsive. She adjusted her angle and trajectory even as Chen was attempting to manipulate them. The result was that Chen's redirection technique, perfected through decades of practice, encountered resistance from an unexpected source. Sarah's ability to remain present and adaptive, the same quality that had made her responses so effective during their previous encounter, now worked against the demonstration Chen was trying to perform. Chen found himself off balance, his technique incomplete, his defensive position compromised. Sarah, still moving with the momentum of her original attack but now unguided by his redirection, continued forward with unstoppable force. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the watching students did not fully comprehend it until after it was over. Chen, caught in an awkward position with his balance disrupted and his technique failed, tried to recover by stepping backward and resetting his stance. But Sarah's continued movement, combined with his own compromised positioning, created a collision that neither of them had anticipated or intended. Sarah's elbow, still moving through the natural arc of her adapted attack, caught Chen in the solar plexus with precisely the kind of force and timing that his own teachings had emphasized as most effective. The impact was not malicious or deliberately harmful, but it was devastatingly accurate. Master Qinwei, 62 years old, two-time national champion, teacher of thousands, guardian of ancient traditions, crumpled to the floor of his own training hall like a discarded puppet. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. Students stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Lu Ming was the first to move, rushing to his master's side and kneeling beside Chen's motionless form. Sarah stood where the collision had occurred, her face pale with shock and horror. "Master!" Lu called out, his voice tight with panic. "Master, can you hear me?" Chen's eyes were open, but unfocused. His breathing was shallow and labored. When he tried to speak, only a weak whisper emerged. Lu leaned closer to hear his master's words. "I cannot." Chen whispered, his voice filled with confusion and distress. "I cannot get up." The impact had not simply knocked Chen down, it had done something to his nervous system, something that left him conscious but unable to coordinate his movements. His decades of conditioning, his lifetime of training, his supposed mastery of internal energy, none of it had protected him from the precise application of force delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right place. Lu Ming immediately began barking orders to the senior students. Zhang Wei, call for medical assistance. Elena, clear the hall of everyone except essential personnel. Marcus, help me examine Master Chen for injuries. As the senior students rushed to follow Lu's instructions, Sarah remained standing in the center of the circle, staring down at the man who had challenged her to transcend her humanity and who was now lying helpless on the floor as a direct result of that challenge. I didn't mean. She began, but her voice trailed off. The truth was that she had done exactly what Chen had taught her to do: remain present, respond authentically, apply technique with precision and timing. The fact that these lessons had resulted in his downfall was not a failure of her training, but perhaps its ultimate success. Chen's eyes found hers, and, for a moment, their gazes locked. In his expression she could see not anger or blame, but a terrible recognition. He had created this moment through his own teaching, his own pushing, his own insistence that she transcend the limitations he perceived in modern humanity. She had done exactly what he had demanded, and, in doing so, she had revealed the fundamental vulnerability that exists at the heart of all human strength. The medical team arrived within 15 minutes, but it felt like hours to everyone present. Chen remained conscious throughout, able to speak in whispers but unable to move his limbs effectively. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was both better and worse than anyone had feared. The strike had not caused permanent nerve damage, but it had triggered a severe neurological response that would require weeks or possibly months of recovery. Chen's motor functions would gradually return, but the incident had also revealed underlying health issues related to his age and the cumulative stress his body had endured over decades of intense training. As the medics prepared to transport Chen to the hospital, he managed to catch Sarah's attention one final time. With tremendous effort, he beckoned her closer so that only she could hear his words. I called humans weak, he whispered, his voice barely audible. But you have shown me, the weakness was in the teacher, not the student. Sarah knelt beside his stretcher, tears running down her face. Master, I'm so sorry. I never wanted. No, Chen interrupted with as much force as he could muster. No apologies. You did exactly what I taught you. The fault is mine. I forgot that when you sharpen a blade, it cuts in all directions. As the medics carried Chen away, Sarah found herself surrounded by students and instructors who didn't know how to process what had just occurred. Some looked at her with awe, others with suspicion, still others with simple confusion. She had achieved something unprecedented in the Academy's history. She had surpassed her master not through years of dedicated study, but through a natural understanding that transcended traditional learning. But the victory, if it could be called that, felt hollow and terrible. Sarah had come to the Academy to learn about strength and discipline, to push herself beyond her previous limitations, to understand what it meant to be truly formidable. Instead, she had learned the most painful lesson of all, that true strength sometimes reveals itself through the devastation it leaves in its wake. Lu Ming approached her as the crowd began to disperse, his expression grave but not hostile. The Academy will need to suspend classes until Master Chen returns, he said quietly. The students will be given the option to remain and continue basic training with the senior instructors, or to leave and resume their studies when Master Chen recovers. And what about me? Sarah asked, her voice hollow. Lu studied her face for a long moment before answering. That depends on what you want to do. You have achieved something remarkable here, something that most martial artists dream of but never accomplish. But you have also learned that achievement can carry a price that is higher than anyone expects to pay. Sarah looked around the hall where she had experienced such growth and discovery over the past month. The space that had once felt sacred and inspiring now seemed haunted by the image of her master lying helpless on the floor, brought down by the very lessons he had worked so hard to teach her. She had come to the Academy believing that Master Chen's harsh words about human weakness were a challenge to be overcome through effort and determination. Instead, she had discovered that he was right about human fragility, not just the fragility of his students, but his own fragility as well. The master who had seemed so powerful and unshakable had proven to be as vulnerable as any of them when faced with the perfect application of his own teachings. In the end, Sarah realized Chen's greatest lesson had not been about transcending human limitations, but about accepting them. Strength was not about becoming invulnerable, it was about understanding vulnerability and choosing to act with wisdom and compassion despite it. As she walked slowly toward the exit of the hall, Sarah understood that she was leaving not just as a student who had learned martial arts techniques, but as a person who had grasped something fundamental about the nature of power, responsibility, and the delicate balance between teacher and student. She had become strong enough to destroy what she most respected, and wise enough to be horrified by that capability. Master Chenwei had called humans weak, then watched his finest student fall in seconds. But the falling had been his own, and the lesson belonged to them both.